Morning everyone, and thank you very much for having me here today to talk about this report. Yeah, if you would like a hard copy and weren't able to grab one when you came in, please do see me afterwards and I can arrange to have one sent to you. But it is fully online as a PDF. So I'm going to talk about, well, this event is about questions, isn't it, today? And we're all here to, I think we've all got a lot of questions about learning and learner analytics and whether never the twain shall meet. I'm not quite sure entirely of the difference between the two. And actually, we were asking a lot of questions through this inquiry, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we discovered last year. So, the Higher Education Commission, to start with, just to let you know who was doing this work and so what our context was, where we were coming from. It's an independent body, and it's made up from people from the education sector and business community, but also the major political parties. So it's chaired by a Conservative peer, and we have membership from the Labour Party, Lib Dems, and from the Tory Party. So that's quite interesting, because what it's trying to do is look at some of the big issues that higher education is facing and take a cross-party approach. I'm sure we'd all welcome some long-term thinking and planning in higher education, and that's what it's trying to do in its own small way. So you can see it was established because of the feeling that there was a need for more informed and reflective discourse on some HE issues. And the way it works is that it looks at policy that's affecting higher education, it holds evidence-based inquiries, and it produces reports, and that's what we did last year in this area. So in 2015 we focused on the role of data in higher education and to look at what we called the transformative effect that data analytics can have. I think, as John was saying, it's early days, so we cannot say exactly what those transformative effects will be, but I think there's enough work out there that we can all see this is important, and that's why you're here today. We particularly focused on the student experience. I think when we looked at the role of data in higher education, if you take that as a title, it's extremely broad, so we looked particularly at student experience and particularly at learner analytics. And we ran for 10 months, and we took evidence from lots of different sources. I'm sure many of your institutions contributed to it. We had one-to-one meetings and panel meetings, and people made written inputs, and we published in January. So from the work that we did, there were three main areas that came back as important, and we used these terms static data and fluid data. So static data is the sort of traditional data that we've all been working with for many years, that's collected by universities and other bodies, of course HEIs and others, the Student Loans Company. And then we also wanted to draw out in the report this concept of fluid data, and there are definitions for this in the report. But in brief, fluid data is some of the new types of data that we might be collecting from interactions with digital systems, particularly thinking about students. So what we might call the student's digital footprint. Now, you can say that's a bit of a blurry divide, what's static and what's fluid, but I think what we were trying to draw out was that we've got all these systems that are now producing digital data that we didn't have before, and it's enabling us to do new things. You know, we have VLEs, we can now know a lot about library usage, we're often tracking lecture attendance. VLE usage itself, we can get into quite deep things about how students are interacting with audio and video in there, for example. So we've got new data. And we really wanted to focus on that area of fluid data, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. We also talked a bit about future trends. Now, I'm not going to touch on that today, because those are quite broad issues, more to do with technology and education, I would say, but they're in the report if you want to look at those. So I'll briefly talk about the static data area. I'm sure this is close to hearts and minds in this room. Just to give you a summary of what we concluded from that. No surprises here, UK higher education system is data rich, and static data has always been a strategic asset for both institutions and government. And actually I felt that was a very positive thing that came out of the work. We don't always perhaps reflect that much on what a positive asset we have in collecting data at a national level. Most other countries don't do that in the way that we do, and we can see with some of the services that are being developed now, like HEIs Plus and so on, people are trying to do more with that. Not to say there isn't a cost to that collection, but actually we have got a data-rich landscape, and that's a real positive thing we should build on. Again, no surprise, universities generate and use enormous volumes of data every day. I think we probably know that. But what came out of the evidence we gathered was that the sector is perhaps not making best use of the possibilities of analysing this data in innovative ways. There's an awful lot of work going on in collecting and having to pass over data, but there could be more done to put systems on top of that data and do things with it. And one of the conclusions that came out and recommendations that was made was that both issues of data capability in institutions, but also the way the collection is done, both need to be addressed. And again, I think probably no surprises, particularly about collection there. So we made a set of recommendations, and as Don said, these have gone to government and to other bodies, and we've had responses from GISC and HESA and UUK about these already. They've published responses, so this has had some impact. So I'll talk through some of these. So in terms of data collection, the HESA process and so on, it is overly complex and burdensome, and as we know through other reports that have come out, particularly through HEDIP, you know, it's things like 549 different collections of data. So we were just really acknowledging the good work that HEDIP's been doing and saying, absolutely, you know, this has got to be sorted out, and the recommendation was that HESA, GISC and UUK should work together to develop a sector-wide strategy for excellent and also innovative data management. And that's those bodies working with the sector. So we really hope that they will do what they're talking about and take that forward and progress it. Implications for institutions from those recommendations is that HEIs will need to work with the central agencies as processes are modernised. And I'm sure you're all aware of this already, but just to kind of reiterate this, the model that they're moving towards is that data collection will be more frequent with reduced processing times. We're talking about instant data and things like that. We understand the implications of that. And we also wanted to emphasise the importance of good data management principles and practice. And again, that came out, I think, through the inquiry sessions we held, that, you know, there is very good practice out there, but there is a need for change, really, in some cases, if we want to really make strategic use of data. And so our recommendation, which we hoped would actually help institutions to make a case where they may feel they need support, perhaps with management, is that institutions should review their internal data management approaches and make sure data is fit for purpose. That might include a roadmap, but what we were hoping was that this would give people some leverage to actually say we need support to do this where it's needed in our institution. So that's static data, and I mean, obviously that's not what we're talking about here today, but I wanted to just give you that context because we see that as something that's vital to underpinning the more interesting work perhaps with learner analytics and learning analytics that you can do. So fluid data and learning analytics, so as I say, this is a major area that we looked at. And why we looked at those and what we concluded from that, I suppose, was that fluid data, and actually taking static data as part of that picture, obviously you're pulling those things together quite often, they've got this potential to give you an instant and accurate picture of a student's performance if you use the right tools, and that's really what we hope people might be able to work towards. Learning analytics, as a definition, we're including in that measurement, collection, analysis and reporting of data about learners. So it's not just about the learning experience, as in the pedagogy, it's about the whole sort of life cycle of the student experience and the data that goes with it. And as John was saying earlier, what came out of the report was this real strong desire that people want for institutions to know more about their learners and be able to support them better. And so the phrase that kept coming up again was student experience, you know, looking at how we can improve our support to students. In the UK, learning analytics, we found, is in relative infancy. I think in the report it kind of says we're actually behind some countries. How you measure things is always an interesting one, but certainly behind North America, I would say, Australasia, some of maybe the Far East. The rest of Europe, it's hard to know, but it felt to us that we're behind. Most institutions haven't fully implemented a system. I think in the health HEDS of e-learning forum data, which we can look at, 1.9% of people said they'd fully implemented. I think actually that was one institution who responded, felt they had fully implemented. I mean, what we mean by fully implemented is obviously something we might be talking about in breaks today, because that's quite an interesting question. And what do you want to implement and why? But we can see from this data, like nearly 50% of people said they haven't done anything in this area at all. And this is this is October 2015, so it's not that long ago. And yeah, less than 20% partially implemented. But then a big chunk of people who are working towards implementation and trying to decide what to do, and I'm sure that's why today will be particularly useful to people. And we touched in the report on several early adopter experiences, because as always with these things, it's really good to learn from what people have been doing. And I know you're hearing about the OU from the OU in a moment, which is really good. They obviously have been doing this for a long time and one of the first ahead. 4 case studies we picked up particularly were the OU, Nottingham Trent, Huddersfield and Derby, and there are in the report there are some nice short case studies and links to further information. Looking at those case studies, what their motivation for using analytics was, it was mostly these 4 things. So there's a big emphasis on retention. And I mean, although we didn't see patterns of which types of institutions are doing this more, not surprisingly, those who are quite interested at the moment tend to be the newer universities who want to recruit and retain students who have quite a strong emphasis on student experience. And this is where the early work being done with learning analytics is really showing, I think, its value, and that is in retention, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But these other areas were also came out and very interesting, and I think we all know student feedback comes up again and again in the National Student Survey as something that students would like more of in a more timely way. And that's something that these institutions are starting to look at. I think Huddersfield in particular is looking at feedback, and that I mean, I think the whole thing of the kind of learning analytics piece and the value of it, when you think, right, what do we do now that could work better? It's helping the student to know where they might be in danger of risk of failure or not doing as well as they might do earlier. So not waiting till exam time, or not waiting till, unfortunately, they've left because, you know, they couldn't keep up with the work, or they had financial issues or work-life balance issues. What we're trying to do with these systems is intervene earlier and kind of raise a red flag, as some of these systems literally do raise a red flag, and say there may be a problem here, and do that perhaps a week or two into the seminar rather than the semester, rather than at the end of the semester or at the end of the year when, you know, it's too late to do anything about it really. So that's why the retention piece, I think, is seen as so important, and the feedback piece is seen as part of that, because it's not just about someone sitting in an office and looking at lots of student data and saying that looks like a problem there. It's about helping the student to take ownership of that. I'll say a little more about that when I show you the Nottingham Trent dashboard. Also, attendance data obviously is something that lots of people are concerned about, and we're having to fulfil obligations, so it can be useful for that. And also, I think this is a growing area, and it's an early area, but enhancing teaching and learning. One of the things that we were seeing through this as a potential area, and that is being used by some people, is that having more rich data, I suppose, about how learners are using digital systems like their VLEs and also e-books and MOOCs and other things, means that the tutor can start to perhaps shape the way that they teach online. So if you know that everyone has had a real problem with a particular assessment and has got a really low result, if you know that quite quickly, rather than at the end of the term, you can go in and perhaps change that system, or you can change your model. If you know that having a 15-minute video followed by an assessment, just everyone stops watching the video after 5 minutes, then you can go in and see what was the problem here. And if you've got access to the full analytics and data about that, then you're able to perhaps enhance teaching and learning and know more about it. And I think that's one of the exciting things for the future that has a lot of potential, but I would say it's early for that. And so, yes, student engagement is a really key factor in this. Students have access to the same data as their tutor. So if we look at the Nottingham Trent student dashboard, this data, this is for an individual student. This is the individual student's engagement score, what they call their engagement score. Now, the engagement score is drawn together from multiple data sources. It's their library use, their VLE use, which is now building access use. But all those things taken together gives them an engagement score, which is about, you know, how well are you engaged with this particular module. And they have found through quite a lot of research that they've done that that's a very good predictor for dropout rate, basically. And so the student has access to this, but their tutors also have access to this same dashboard. They can see how they're doing week by week. They can see how they're doing against the course average. And for the tutor, a red light will appear, you know, if there's a sort of a concern, this person looks like they're likely to drop out. They can then get in touch with the student, and they can together talk about what the issue might be. Now, NTU has trialled this over several years. They piloted, I think, in 13-14, rolled out last year. It's been incredibly popular with the students. They won the HEs award for student experience because of this. Students actually really like this. We hear anecdotes of students sort of comparing dashboards with each other and kind of saying, you know, look how I'm doing or you're doing. I mean, I think it's early days to know how exactly this is going to work and how it will be effective, but it's that thing about engagement, how engaged you are. Now, that's not about performance, so we didn't talk in the report about systems for trying to predict grades, for example, and I think that's quite a sensitive area, and I think we wouldn't go there. But certainly engagement is an incredibly important thing. I thought I'd just briefly talk about some of the issues and challenges that can come with introducing learning analytics that came out through the work. And one of the key things, I think, and perhaps this is one of the key barriers and why more people haven't put all this in place already, is being very clear what the purpose of putting this in place is. What are you trying to achieve by this? You know, is it... So NTU, I think they had looked at, you know, they were concerned about potential dropout. They had found that a third of students in the first year had not dropped out, but had raised concerns about whether they would continue in their studies, and I think that's quite a similar percentage in other institutions. That was what they wanted to address with this work, and I think it's, for any institution, you've got to be very clear why you're doing this, so that you can focus. And I suppose, I mean, that's no different from any new system, is it? And so the recommendation we made was that putting this in place, it should be driven by improvement in learning and teaching processes and student engagement, and that it should be used, as I said earlier, for formative and not summative purposes. So we were saying this should be used most effectively at this stage of maturity to help students perform better, not to score them and say, you know, this is going to go into your final degree, and, you know, you will be marked about this. One of the reasons we made that recommendation was, well, we think that's the most effective way to use the systems at the moment. They're not ready for anything else. But also, if you're going to start kind of grading students based on data in that way, there's a real strong temptation to try and game the system, and, you know, people swiping over and over again into buildings, or you know, etc., which is not the point. As going back to be clear about the purpose. So when we talk about formative, not summative, that's the key point there, I think. We also heard from lots of different people that there are issues of institutional capability and resourcing, that often where work is being done in this area, it's being done piecemeal in different departments. There's not many institutions are taking a whole institutional approach to this. It all sounds so familiar for the kind of VLE introduction and many other things over the years, I think. And I mean, and I found that quite surprising, but that seemed to be the picture. I mean, there are exceptions, but generally that's happening. And so, not surprisingly, we felt that the leaders of institutions and leaders of departments need to drive forward a culture shift here. And we were hoping with this whole report really to say how important we think data is and how integral it is to all aspects of the university, and really make that message go home. We hope it has sunk home. It's really good that Universities UK have been very interested in this and continue to be interested in this area. So people are listening. But yes, this quote from the report, 75% of senior managers had limited understanding of the potential benefits and outcomes of implementing learning analytics in their institutions. That might be a bit of an optimistic figure, I think, sometimes. So the recommendation we made was that HEIs should make sure the digital agenda is being led at an appropriate level, and I think that's about people being given authority and so on. And my final slide here, have I missed one? Oh no, that's right, sorry, was talking about tools and the marketplace, and it's great today that vendors have come together here, but I found this interesting again from the Heads of E-Learning Forum survey, how fragmented the market is at the moment. And you know, you can see just over 15% of people have got specific software. Lots of people are using elements from within their existing VLE or their student record system or another tool. There's some brave people who develop their own system, but no doubt that will lead to other good tools that might be used by others. So there's fragmentation there, and I think the JISC survey that they did, I think a couple of years before that, with 13 institutions, they found that everyone was using a different system. So that, I just thought that might be useful to share that there isn't at the moment a kind of common approach being taken, and of course we've got work being done nationally to try and get some shared systems in place and sharing of expertise there as well. But I think people are tending to kind of go on and use their own systems, so there are challenges with that. Okay, so that's a brief summary, and if you want to look at the report online, there it is, my contact details, and I've got some time now for some questions.
So we've got a question for Sarah?
Or a comment?
Hi, can you hear me okay? I'd just like to ask, with the Nottingham Trent dashboard being an example, did you find any issues with data protection when you're dealing with students using these sort of dashboards? Because there's been some discussions around the issue of data protection.
Yes, absolutely. And we actually, in the report, there are some quite clear recommendations about the issues of data protection and data security. And I think I did have a slide on that, but somehow for some reason it doesn't come up. I don't know why. There's probably some issue with it. But that's one of the things. Having the right code of practice in place around that is extremely important. It's one of our key recommendations. And I'll just see which number it is because it's in here. So recommendation 4 is that institutions should put in place clear ethical policies and codes of practice that govern the use of student data and analytics, and at a minimum they should address student privacy, security of data and consent. And we talk quite a lot in the report about informed consent. So we were hearing that, not surprisingly, in many institutions, students are in a way signing away their rights to their data being used in these systems at registration, with a whole load of other things, and they're perhaps not understanding fully what they're signing up to. And actually, students may not care all that much. I mean, when we talk to students, they didn't seem to be terribly bothered. But I think, being ethical, we have to be very clear with them what they are signing up to. And so, yeah, so informed consent was the approach we were recommending there.
If I may ask, in the 4 institutions where this has been piloted, did those institutions take specific steps to address that in advance that you're aware of?
Yes. I mean, I know the Open University developed, I think it's the world's first code of practice or guidelines, which I don't know if you're going to talk about those. No. But anyway, but anyway, they're mentioned in the report, and they're very good. And JISC has cited those in their kind of recommendations in this area as well. So we definitely think before you get involved in doing this, you should be very clear what you're doing, and be explicit about that, and inform students, and if necessary, kind of educate them on that. Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't very clear about that, but yes.
Hi. From my short time in the sector, I'm seeing quite a difference in attitude with some of the senior management towards the treatment of data and the concerns they might have about data privacy and security. And now the younger generations coming up who'll just sign their information away, as we talked about, for very little. How do you see that as a blocker of getting some of these systems? I've sat in meetings where people have simply said that students won't want to share their data. They precisely won't want to do what you've just identified that they do. How do we help people sort of empathise the fact that, I'm 43, I don't understand how a 20-year-old works. If you're one generation even further away, it gets more difficult. And I see kids, friends, 14-year-olds playing World of Tanks, and as soon as they finish, they want to know how well they did in their game, how they competed, their contribution. And there's a whole generation that see collaborative working and data sharing that way that perhaps we didn't.
Absolutely, and I think, there is resistance, and people being cautious, which is, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because, culturally we've been expected to be cautious about these things and kind of think on students' behalf and be extra careful, but you don't want that to become a constraint to progress. I mean, I think in terms of how you kind of influence them, well, I'm sure you do have forums where they meet students and talk about that, but that might be one way, would be to get them together to talk about what might a code of practice look like. And because I was very surprised actually at how relaxed students were about these things, and it is, you often are you're basing, I know I base things on anecdote, not on actually on evidence and talking to people. And so I think for any institution, when they're developing their code of practice, certainly getting the Students' Union involved is a good thing. I'm sure you would do that anyway, but I don't think I have the answer to that. But
we've got some quite good analytics at University of Bolton. It's called the Pulse. It measures student attendance, it measures their assessments, but the difficulty we've had in extending that is what value you give to certain metrics. I was looking at Nottingham Trent and their sort of library attendance. Now obviously for certain courses, if you're looking at sort of web development, games development, a lot of those students probably won't go to the university. They won't be reading books. You know, they'll be doing it online, downloading e-books off Pirate Bay. So that's the difficulty we've had in what value you put on certain metrics. And I'd be quite interested to know how they calculated, you know, positive scores for that.
Yeah, I think they put a lot of thought into the exact weighting for all those things. I mean, it might be worth getting in touch with them directly to talk about that, I would think, too. Because obviously, as you say, for different courses, it's going to be very different, isn't it? And in some cases, library use is not that relevant. I think it's all about, well, it's that whole kind of what's the magic formula under the bonnet in a way, isn't it? That how much weighting you put onto different things is a really interesting point. And I think when you're going to hear from the OU in a minute, they're actually doing predictive analytics, aren't you? Yeah, so there it's even more important, really, how, you know, in a way with the dashboard, the score is important, but the whole point of the score is to enable conversation, and those things balance each other. So, you know, it's not likely that someone would come out with as a big concern just because of library usage if they've been using the VLE and attending. Do you know what I mean? There's a balance there, but I think where it's predictive, it's more important, really, because it's potentially a lot more powerful. But then again, you know, as we're saying, I mean, on one hand we're saying this is all very powerful, on the other hand we're saying use it with caution, aren't we, I think? And it is more about formative approaches, so it's about helping students. And I think it's about learning about what we're doing as we go along. It's extremely early days in all of this, and not making some terrible mistakes that, because you know, I felt working on this study, actually a lot of learning is not done online or with anything digital, and that's not necessarily being recorded. So, you know, we have to look at each student in the whole, don't we, and just recognise these are all tools that can be very powerful and helpful, but they've got to be looked at in a context. Yeah, well, and you know, because I know some people are, I think NTU are now experimenting with e-book data and pulling that in as well. But then, as you say, they may not be using e-books through the official, you know, university channel. And what else are people using online that's not being tracked at all? I mean, lots of resources we may all be using online, the university has no idea about what they are, do we? You know what I mean? We're not gathering that data. So it's a partial picture. Yeah.
Hi Sarah, Matt Sherlock from Ex Libris. I was just, I was interested in that the teaching and learning interventions seem to be something that we need to think about going forward. I would controversially say we need to think about that as part of developing the learner analytics policy, because it's a bit like the surveys and closing the loop. I think it's absolutely important to consider the interventions, the methods of actually taking that data and using it in a constructive way. I think that's absolutely essential to a learning analytics policy for a university.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. Yeah. No, I think you're right. That should be considered at that point. I suppose I was thinking the actual using the data in the rich data for shaping learning and teaching interventions themselves, as in feeding that back in. We haven't even got all that data at the moment in many instances, you know. So I suppose that's right. But I think you're right. You should be writing your policy to plan ahead.
I think, you know, teaching staff are already doing this, but on a very micro level. You know, they're taking formative assessment in classes and all the rest of it.
That's right.
This just develops a richer picture for them to interact on, and maybe you know, drives those interventions more actively. Thanks.
Hi, I just wondered, in your opinion, do you think you can have an effective analytics system without an effective attendance monitoring system?
Well, it seems to me from what I've heard, I mean, I'm not an expert in all of the systems, but yes, because not everyone does have that in place, and it's not essential. I mean, you want to be having enough data sources to be able to get a rich enough picture for it to be meaningful. But if you've got good data from your VLE and good data from your library, then I think, you know. And some people also include submission of assignments in there, and others don't. So, but again, if you fed that in, then of course, you know, you've got, again, a very good source of people who are actually putting their assignments in, and then there's a pretty good, you know, they are working and they are engaging with the course, and they've been somewhere and submitted it, even if it's online, you know. So again, that's another factor that some people put in and others don't.